Only the dead have seen the end of war. Only the dead have seen the end of war. That's a famous quote that is attributed to Plato, but other sources suggest it was the Spanish American philosopher George Santayana. The film Black Hawk Down attributes it to Plato. Other sources put this into question. General MacArthur in a 1962 speech also attributed to Plato, but like many famous quotes, there is some debate over whether this was actually attributed to Plato or not. Regardless, it's a powerful quote, and it's certainly a thought-provoking one. Tonight I've been watching the film Apocalypse Now, which is generally ranked as one of the greatest war films ever made. I watched the Redux version, which is well over 3 hours. Very powerful Vietnam War film. So I've been thinking of the subject of war and conflict. The world right now seems like a very fragile place. I was contemplating about making a video about these World War III scenarios. Actually, I believe it was Winston Churchill argued that the First World War, the first global war, was in fact the 7 Years' War, because that expanded across continents. So if you want to get really meticulous about it and technical, then arguably the 7 Years' War was the First World War, the Napoleonic Wars was the Second World War, the First World War as we know it was the Third World War, the Second World War was in fact the Fourth World War, and arguably the Cold War was the Fifth World War. So actually, if there's any scenario that we're going to face, it would be the Sixth World War. But in popular imagination, the First World War was 1914 to 1918, the Second World War 39 to 45. So with that in mind, there is this concept constantly brought up of a potential Third World War. There's been many scenarios, of course, where that could be the case. But instead of amalgamating that into this video, I might save that for another video. Rather, for this video, I want to talk about war as a perpetual state of human nature. It's a rather depressing thought, of course, because war is a terrible thing. In 2011, a book was published by Steven Pinker, and he argued that actually human conflict is decreasing, and there's cause for optimism because if we look at the global situation, things are improving, in his opinion. Now, in some regards, he's actually correct in this assertion, because if you look on the surface at the world today, for example, the global situation does seem very fragile. And this is something that can be argued at certain points in recent history. Immediately after 9/11, the world seemed very fragile. At the time of the invasion of Iraq, the world seemed very fragile. With every North Korean nuclear test, the world seems very fragile. So this isn't exactly a completely new phenomenon. In terms of actual violence, if you look a bit into it, if you look at the number of armed conflicts going on and the number of people who are dying in those armed conflicts, the world overall was more violent in the 1960s and 1970s. That is to say, more people were dying in armed conflicts in those decades than they were over the past, say, 15 years. Now, of course, if you're a Syrian or an Iraqi, that would be like a bad joke. But I'm talking about the global situation. Sometimes it's easy to get depressed and kind of think the world is in a terrible state, but I think it's also important to look at the counter argument, which is that certain situations have improved. I mean, if we look at two brutal armed conflicts, three in fact, Angola, Mozambique, Colombia. Angola and Mozambique both saw very brutal civil wars. Both of those conflicts are now over. Granted, there's been a little bit of a resurgence in Mozambique, but I don't think there's any chance of it going back to full-scale civil war. Colombia, thanks to the efforts of President Santos and many other factors, Colombia is finally seeing real plausible signs of peace. Peru, there is low level conflict going on, but nothing comparable to the levels in the 1980s and 1990s. Um, so there are many conflicts that were going on in the Cold War are now over. However, there is always a risk of armed conflict breaking out, and there's certain parts of the world which just seem to be in a perpetual state of war. The Sudans, Iraq, Afghanistan would be three examples. I would include the DRC. Um, in those four countries, the Democratic Republic of Congo, both Sudans, Iraq, and Afghanistan, there has basically been a perpetual state of some sort of armed conflict for decades. Um, so it's very difficult in those situations to see any peace in the near future. Probably Somalia can be included in that. Of course, this ties hand in hand with failed state theory and the definition of a failed state. There are parts of the world that the situation is so grim it is very, very difficult to see a bright future anytime soon. And there are places in the world where there is always a potential flare up of armed conflict. Um, so, looking at it that way and looking at certain tensions going on in the world today, I mean, if we look at the exact situation right now, the Korean Peninsula is always tense, but it's particularly tense right now with reports that Trump has ordered the US Navy to go there. The Chinese are really between a rock and a hard place because they don't want to be seen to be um, too allied with an unstable and paranoid totalitarian regime in North Korea. But at the same time, the Chinese don't want the Americans to take action in North Korea because that would mean a refugee crisis on their borders. There's a lot of reasons why China has good reason for not openly backing an American plan for intervention in the Korean Peninsula. They fear a unified Korea more than they fear North Korea using a nuclear strike on, say, Japan or South Korea. Um, so it's a very, complex situation. The Middle East is a complete quagmire. That's what it seems like. If we look at the Middle East right now, Yemen, Iraq, Syria are all in a mess. It's a real dangerous situation. Afghanistan, it's been reported that Trump has just ordered the largest American conventional bomb ever. That will obviously details will emerge from this, but it's a major story that apparently has been conducted against ISIS tunnels in the north of the country, northwest, I think. Details are going to emerge. I hope there has been no civilian fatalities. There cannot be a repeat of what happened in Mosul, because needless to say, whenever there's civilian fatalities, that is the best recruiting agent for ISIS. Collateral damage wears thin as an excuse when every civilian death acts as a recruiting agent for Islamist propaganda. And it's wrong. In the end of the day, whatever your political allegiances are, nothing can condone the violent death of a civilian. Um, so, yeah, looking at the global situation right now, it's very tense. There's no way around that. So, it's not necessarily about armed conflict, but about the potential for armed conflict, which is very grave right now. So, I wonder what Steven Pinker makes of the current situation. And it may be that Plato or George Santayana were right about that phrase. It's worth mentioning there's a tribe in Brazil, I forget, I think it's the Yanomami tribe. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but they're known for being in a perpetual state of warfare. Um, and certainly there were certain Native American tribes that it was literally a coming of age for young men in those those tribal nations, to be warriors. This can be seen all over the world. Um, this is, on one hand, a rather depressing thought, and maybe it is naive to think that 7.4 billion people are ever going to be in a situation, and that's an increasing population, are ever going to be in a situation where there's no conflict going on. I think in the future conflict is going to change, whereas traditional conflict was nation states fighting nation states. Since really the 1960s, 1970s onwards, warfare has been more guerrilla style warfare, far more involvement of civilians, far more sort of low level operations as opposed to large scale pitched battles. That's not to say pitched battles haven't happened, but definitely the nature of warfare has changed. And then there's been other factors, the increase in cyber warfare. Um, there's going to be also, I think, an increase in warfare regarding natural resources, and that I think in the future is definitely going to be a major source of tension. I think we're going to see fewer armed conflicts necessarily between nation states, although, like I say, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is very tense. Um, Russia and its neighboring states, there's a lot of situations going on. Only the dead have seen the end of war. Okay, let me know your thoughts. Personally, my feeling is that outright pacifism, that is, this idea that the world is at some point going to be in total peace, I think it's incredibly naive. And rather than hoping for that, because it's a cruel hope, rather than hoping for that, I think the focus needs to be on better governance and reducing the sources of armed conflict as much as possible. It may be that there will always be some sort of conflict going on in this world. The focus should be on governments taking responsibility to reduce tensions. That's why diplomacy is essential. Um, but the sources of conflict shouldn't be overlooked. Repression, conflicts over natural resources, as in verbal conflicts over natural resources, all these factors. There's no quick fix to this because the exact situation of each conflict is not exactly the same. But anyway, that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Was Plato correct? Only the dead have seen the end of war. It's a very gloom prediction, but maybe he was correct. Let me know your thoughts.